So with your Bibles open to Proverbs chapter 11, let's start off here in verse 1. Dishonest scales are an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. An abomination, and we find this word used throughout the Old Testament, but specifically in Proverbs, is something that's terrible, something that's horrific, something that turns your stomach. Maybe you see reports on the news of some child being beaten or misused, and it turns your stomach. Maybe it's the thought of certain types of food that just sort of turns your stomach. But when the Lord says it's an abomination, it means that he hates with utter disgust. Like you and I ought to hate evil. But the Lord does this, but what does he do it towards? The dishonest scales. In other words, the scale, if you remember from the ancient days, they would take these scales, not like our grocery store scales, but it was a scale that had a balance back and forth, and you'd put a weight that said was 1 pound, and then you'd measure out and you put your green beans or your corn or whatever else on it until it balanced evenly. And of course, dishonest salespeople would carve out something or make something heavier in order to tilt the scales in their favor. And what God is saying to us is that he loves honesty. He hates or has an abomination for those that are dishonest. I think all of us in one time or another in our lives have faced somebody who was dishonest with us, who shaded the truth or told us partial truths. But that's not what God delights in. He delights in those who speak the truth, who are not defrauding others. He delights in that. Verse 2, when pride comes, then comes shame. But with the humble is wisdom. So what's the number one thing if somebody's proud that they're concerned about? Becoming shameful, of something being exposed. And it's ironic that those who are filled with the most pride are also the ones are afraid of being shamed. But God says specifically that if you're a person filled with pride, that shame is coming. The Bible tells us in the New Testament, 2 specific places, in James chapter 4, verse 6, and 1 Peter 5:5, where it says, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. All of us at one time or another have messed up. And if we've messed up and we try to cover up our mess up with somebody else's fault, it just makes it worse, doesn't it? But if we admit, hey, you know what, I messed up, I was wrong, that sense of humility, God is gracious to us. And that's what we want, that's what we need. Matter of fact, over in Micah 6:8, it tells us this. Speaking about God, he has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To do justly, like we talked about, honest scales, to love mercy, and notice this, and to walk humbly with your God. You see, God is all-powerful and almighty, and we ought to respond to that in humility, that I don't know everything. You can be very smart and talented in some area of your life. You can be extremely skilled in something, but there also needs to be coupled with humility. And that's what the Lord wants to bless us if we respond to things in humility. In verse 3, he goes on and says, the integrity of the upright will guide them, but the perversity of the unfaithful will destroy them. You see, what God is saying to us is the man or woman who lives with integrity, that would be a man or a woman who's trustworthy, that their life exhibits trustworthiness, without shame, without any secrets. God recognizes that person as an upright person. And because of that, that integrity will guide them. As you have decisions in your life to make, should I do this or should I do that? Let your integrity or your trustworthiness guide you. In other words, again, be honest. That if the clerk at the store gave you too much change and you realize that before you walk out, let your integrity guide you and say, okay, I need to come back. It'll totally freak them out because nobody ever comes back to give them extra change back. People come back when they're shorted change, but not when they give too much. But what a great opportunity to even share the gospel with them. Well, why are you coming back? Well, because I'm afraid of God. I don't mean that in a scared sense, but I fear the Lord. I want to do what's right before the Lord. And the right thing before the Lord is to return something that was given too much. But that's the integrity. But then the perversity of the unfaithful. Those that are always looking to get one over on somebody, because of that, they'll find themselves, because they're unfaithful, it will destroy them. Verse 4 goes on to say, riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. You may recall over in Luke chapter 12, we talked about this last week. It was the story of the wealthy farmer who had an abundance of crops. And he said, my barns can't hold this, so what am I going to do? I'm going to tear down my old barns, build myself brand new barns, and then I'll take my rest or my retirement. I'll be satisfied. Everything's good. I've got food stored up for years. And Jesus went on to say that that farmer didn't understand that his soul was required of him that very night. That even though he had a huge bank account or a huge savings account, or in this case his barns were stuffed full of food, it didn't help him for eternity. And that's what we need to do. We need to be mindful of eternity. Verse 5, the righteousness of the blameless will direct his way. This is a parallel to the verse that we read earlier about the integrity of the upright. But the wicked will fall by their own wickedness. In other words, they'll be ensnared by their own untruthfulness or own lies. Verse 6, the righteousness of the upright will deliver them, but the unfaithful will be caught in their lust. Again, the same idea, that if we're faithful, it will guide us. If we're a people of integrity, that will guide us. When we go about our lives and we are thinking, what does Jesus want me to do? That will guide you. But if instead you're ruled by your lust, I want something more, it will ensnare you and entrap you and cause you to come to great ruin. Verse 7 goes on, when a wicked man dies, his expectation will perish. Somebody who's wicked, somebody who's not a person of integrity, they may have all kinds of plans. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to store up this, I'm going to do that. But the moment they die, all of their expectations are gone. However, the hope of the unjust will also perish. The hope of the unjust, those that want to take advantage or looking for the right opportunity to sort of squeeze somebody else in another way. Here's the thing, that those who don't have their hearts and their minds focused on eternity, those who are not living by the wisdom of God, this gift that keeps on giving, they forget that one day they will stand before God. Over in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, it tells us this, and it is appointed for men to die once, and after this is the judgment. Do you keep that in your mind, in your heart? That life sometimes isn't fair. And I'm not justifying the wickedness that we find in life around us. But the end result is not how much stuff we have, how successful or how difficult life is. At the end is when we stand before Jesus Christ. And Jesus will either say, depart from me, I never knew you, or he will say, welcome, well done, good and faithful servant. And if we will keep that in mind, it will guide us in our day-by-day lives. Verse 8, the righteous is delivered from trouble, and it comes to the wicked instead. Again, this is the person who puts their faith and their trust in Jesus Christ. What would Jesus do is another vernacular that we could use. And the idea is I'm following Christ. I'm letting that guide me. But wickedness, or those who rebel against the Lord, is going to be their destruction. Let me give you a couple examples of this. Do you remember the Israelites? As Moses led them and they came out of Egypt from their bondage, their slavery, notice this, that they were delivered from their trouble through the Red Sea. But what happened to the Egyptians that were chasing them? It was their destruction. How about this? Do you remember the story of Mordecai and Esther? How Mordecai was rescued. Now, if you remember the story, Mordecai was the Jewish guy who was the advisor to Esther. Haman was the bad guy in this story, and he had devised a plan to kill all the Jews. Sometimes we think some of the anti-Semitic things that we see in the world around us is new. It's not new. It's been going on for a long, long time. So Mordecai was rescued from the gallows. Haman had built gallows that was determined that he was going to hang Mordecai from. So instead, Haman himself was killed on those same gallows. So Mordecai was in great danger, but the Lord delivered him, and then he turned the tables, and Haman himself was destroyed by that same thing. We find that in Esther chapter 5 and chapter 7. We also notice that Peter was snatched from death while his persecutors and jailers were condemned. So we find this as a recurring theme both in the Old and New Testament, that those who trust in the Lord will find the Lord to be their deliverer. What we do need to understand is when God delivers us, sometimes it's not from pain, but sometimes it's in the midst of pain or difficulty. The ultimate outcome is before the Lord. Verse 9, the hypocrite with his mouth destroys his neighbor, but through knowledge the righteous is delivered. One of the identifying marks of somebody who's a hypocrite is that they destroy people with their words, but sincere love looks to build others up. Politicians are great targets for this sort of thing. And it doesn't matter what political party, whether you're talking national politics, state politics, or local politics. Don't we find so many times, or at least one of the things that frustrate me about politics, is the hypocrites or the hypocrisy that we see sometimes. Yet the Bible speaks about that. Haman, again, remember we talked about Haman just a moment ago, but Haman, under the pretense of loyalty, he went to the king and said, "King, I'm the most loyal person," when in fact he was devising a plan to kill all the Jews. So in that false loyalty, he sought to destroy an entire nation, according to Esther chapter 3. But what we see is God turned the tables on him. Does that mean that Esther had an easy life? No, if you remember the story, Esther was scared. She was afraid for her life. But yet the Lord radically delivered at the last moment. And so that's the general theme that we see. If you or I are trying to destroy somebody else, or we see somebody else who's always attacking somebody else, it's a sign that they probably are a hypocrite. But if instead we're building somebody up, we find somebody who builds others up, then there's probably somebody there who has knowledge or wisdom, this gift that keeps on giving. And again, knowledge and wisdom flows from a relationship with Jesus Christ. Verse 10, when it goes well with the righteous, the city rejoices. And when the wicked perish, there is jubilation or a party. I don't know about you, but I remember my personal reaction when I heard about Charles Manson's death. Remember Charles Manson from Helter Skelter? A wicked man. And when I heard that he had died in prison, my heart leaped a little bit. Because there was this constant fear in my own mind, in my own heart, that somehow he might get paroled. Remember, he's in California. They got kind of some weird thinking. I'm from California. To let people go. And I'm thinking, oh no, don't let him go. And so I rejoiced a little bit. I care for his eternal soul, but his soul is determined by how he responded to Jesus Christ. And according to everything that I know about him, he absolutely rejected Jesus Christ. On a side note, there were others who are part of this Manson family who came to saving faith in Jesus Christ. So God is able to rescue those souls. When such men, those that would be righteous men, godly men, are encouraged and advanced into places of power, I think, for example, of Joseph. Remember Joseph in Egypt? His brothers sold him into slavery. Potiphar's wife falsely accused him. But he was raised up to power because he was an honest man, a fair man. And when he was raised up to that, the entire Egyptian nation was blessed because there was a godly man at the godly time in a godly place. So when those sorts of things happen, the city rejoices, the citizens rejoice. However, when the wicked perish, they rejoice then. A little side note, and again, what we might sort of consider ancient history, it's during or after the time of Christ. But you remember this gentleman in the Roman Empire, his name was Caesar Nero. Do you remember any stories about him? He was a radical, crazy guy. He was a Charles Manson-like, except he was in charge of Rome. He hated Christians. He literally took Christians, put them on poles, and lit them on fire to be torches as he paraded himself up and down. He was a lunatic. Guess what the Roman citizens did when they found out of his death? They threw a party. They were excited because this crazy man was no longer in charge. Verse 11, by the blessing of the upright, the city is exalted, but is overthrown by the mouth of the wicked. A city can be exalted because there's righteous men and women in that city that seek the Lord. But the same token, the wicked can destroy that. Verse 12, he who is devoid of wisdom despises his neighbor, but a man of understanding holds his peace. Here's the idea. Maybe it's your neighbor, maybe it's somebody in the family, maybe it's somebody at work. But when you are devoid of wisdom, when you don't have the gift that keeps on giving, guess what? You despise, you want to tear down your neighbor. Maybe you have neighbors like that. On the other hand, a man or a woman of understanding holds his peace. In other words, the person who has wisdom, the person who has a relationship with a living God, is a person that knows when to say something, when to hold back. Years ago, I remember one of my sisters was visiting, and it was a difficult time in her life. This was years and years ago. My children were little, like 1.5 and 3 or something like that. And my sister was totally freaking out about something, and she was yelling at everybody, really. It didn't matter what it was. And we were driving her back to the airport. The kids were in the very back of the van. And then there's this small little voice that says, why are you upset? Why are you bothered about this? And it was the truth of a young child being spoken in this particular case, at just the right time. Because it took her from a 10 on the Richter scale back down to, say, a 5 or a 6. And sometimes we need people to say the right things at the right time in our lives. Husbands and wives, you know this, you ought to know this about each other, that there are times that you can ratchet things up, or you can hold your peace and let it settle a little bit, and then come back and remember to put the toilet seat down, or whatever it might be. But there's this idea that somebody who has wisdom, somebody who has this abiding relationship with Jesus Christ, somebody who has the gift that keeps on giving, knows when to say things. And sometimes it is much wiser to hold your peace than just to say whatever comes to your mind. Continuing on with this theme, in verse 13, it goes on to say, a talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is of a faithful spirit conceals a matter. Now, we're not talking about concealing sin, but the idea of keeping confidence. So a talebearer is an unfaithful gossip, an uncontrollable talker, who loves the power and intrigue of revealing secrets. For them, the secrets are a form of power. Hey, did you ever hear? Did you know that? And want to tell everybody, or want to go from place to place, or from crowd to crowd. And they get a sense of power of being in the know and sort of throwing everyone else under the bus. The talebearer, again, is the person who goes from place to place or person to person in a manner such to just tell stories on everyone else, making it their business, and they scatter reports. The opposite of that is the man or the woman who is faithful, whose faithful spirit knows the appropriate time to conceal a matter. In other words, you don't have to tell everybody every detail of your business or somebody else's business. If you've been sick and you had diarrhea, you know what? I really don't want to know all the business of that, okay? I love you, but I don't really care about what color your diarrhea was. Okay? But sometimes there are people like that that just want to say everything. And a confidant, or somebody who you can trust, is somebody that says, okay, I'm not going to tell everybody. I'll just tell them you're not feeling well. I won't give them the explosive details of what's going on.
Oh, no.
But that's the idea. Are we going to be faithful friends? Now, when it says conceal or hides a matter, it's not talking about covering up sin. But it's the idea that there are things that everyone else doesn't need to know about. Okay? Thank you. You don't need to know about the explosive diarrhea in somebody's life. Okay? Verse 14. Where there is no counsel, the people fall. But in a multitude of counselors, there is great safety. You see, God has designed the system or the governments that we live under, whether it be church or in a public arena, where he gives leadership and guidance. Leadership is important. In many cases in our country, we lack godly or men and women of leadership that are people of integrity. They're more concerned about what they get out of it, as opposed to what they can impart to others. Whether it be in sports with coaches or politicians or in business, sometimes, many times, there are people who are only concerned about themselves. But it's rare, but it's a blessing when there's somebody who's concerned about the team as opposed to themselves. Concerned about the employees instead of just what they get out of it. Concerned for the community as opposed to what they get out of it. And you and I, when we have decisions that we need to make, it's good, it's wise for us to seek out a multitude of counselors. Shame on us when we think in pride and arrogance that I know everything. Shame on me when I think that I'm an expert on everything. No one person can be an expert about everything. And so it's good to bring in others to be counselors. In business, it's the same thing. They constantly are bringing in advisors or counselors to make sure that they're doing the right thing in the best way. Politicians ought to do that. Coaches ought to do that. A coach can't be an expert on everything. And you ought to bring in others to say, okay, let this guy help you with strengthening, and this guy help you with speed, and this guy help you with strategy, or whatever else it might be. But it's the idea of bringing in a multitude of counselors. So no woman or man has all gifts and wisdom. And so when we seek out the multitude of counselors, we're looking for what is God's will. Now notice, as we seek out that multitude of counselors, we're going to be looking for somebody who is faithful to not be a talebearer and tell everybody what's going on. In other words, if it was sports, you don't hire the guy that's going to go back to the other team and tell them everything that you're doing and all your strengths and weaknesses. You want a multitude of counselors. You want somebody to come in to help you. But you also want to be sure it's somebody that's not going to go and tell everyone else what's going on. And so that's why we need that wisdom. Verse 15, he who is surety for a stranger will suffer, but the one who hates being surety is secure. And we talked about this before, but surety is this idea of being a guarantor of somebody else's loan or business. It's not speaking against loans, but it's speaking against putting your house or your car on the line for somebody that you don't even know whether they're going to be faithful there tomorrow or not. That's the idea of it. And surety usually involves exorbitant interest rates. And the idea that your means of transportation is now on the line, whether this person decides to pay the bill or not. And of course, if you've ever co-signed for a loan, or you've had somebody else do that, you know that if that individual who's responsible for the loan doesn't pay, guess who they come after? They come after you. And so it's speaking against that. But those who don't want to do that, he says they have security. Why? Because their car or their house is not on the line. And that's the idea. Verse 16, a gracious woman retains honor, but a ruthless man retains riches. So the idea of the gracious woman is the woman who carries herself with a sense of honor or dignity. The gracious woman is a one who has modesty, prudence, virtues. She renders herself acceptable and pleasing to God and to other people. That's the gracious woman. The ruthless man is a man who just simply gathers whatever he wants and tries to take it. Now, he might win the advantage for the short term, but for eternity, he's going to lose out. Verse 17, the merciful man does good for his own soul. Not for his own pocketbook, not for his own bank account, but for his own soul. Are you spending time to feed your own soul? But he who is cruel troubles his own flesh. You see, we live in a culture where people say, what do I get out of it? And God's response is, you ought to be concerned about your soul for eternity more than the comfort of whether something felt comfortable to you or not. What good, and Jesus said this, what good is it if we gain everything in this life, but we lose our very souls? What good is it for it to be the wealthiest man or woman in the world that has all kinds of power and prestige, but then to come face to face with Jesus Christ and for him to say, depart from me, I never knew you. However, the one who responds to God in humility and says, Lord, help me, is the one who will rescue his soul. Verse 18, the wicked man does deceptive work, but he who sows righteousness will have a sure reward. Again, the wicked man is likened to somebody who does deceptive work. It's the person that rips you off. We all talk about this from time to time, don't we? We want somebody to come do work for us because we need our water heater replaced or our car fixed. And don't we always ask one another, who's an honest mechanic? Who's an honest plumber? It's not that I don't want to pay for the work. I just want somebody that's going to be honest with me and not rip me off. Not somebody that's going to be deceptive. And so if we can do that in our day-to-day living, shouldn't we do that in our spiritual life as well? That's where God wants us to be. As righteousness leads to life, so he who pursues evil pursues his own death. A man or woman who pursues righteousness, right standing before God, will enhance their life. Now, it doesn't mean that you'll be fat, dumb, and happy. But what it does mean is that you'll have the peace of Christ that surpasses understanding, even though there's a Christ-rejecting world. But whoever pursues evil is really hastening their own death, and especially their spiritual death. The idea of somebody who pursues evil is somebody who pursues uncleanness or greediness, according to Ephesians chapter 4, as opposed to somebody who's right with the Lord, somebody who has this gift that keeps on giving. This is relationship with Jesus Christ that guides me from my schoolwork to dealing with my neighbors, to dealing with my family, to dealing with the job site. It's all about my relationship with Christ. And as I'm at work or I'm at school or I'm dealing with my neighbors, it's because of my relationship with Jesus Christ I can deal with them in a godly way. Verse 20, those who are of perverse heart are an abomination. Again, we looked at this word at verse 1, abomination. That is something that's deplorable. That's something that turns the stomach. It's something that God hates, this abomination. So what's an abomination? Those who are perverse or wicked heart. But the blameless in their ways are his delight. There is a sense in which we are all victims of sin. Okay? But one another, and perhaps greater sense, in which are you willing participants in sin? It's one thing if somebody rips you off. Somebody steals. We all have this propensity to sin in our own lives, our what we call our fallen nature. But do we enjoy it? Are we pursuing sin? Are we looking for opportunities to participate in sin? Or instead do we want to get away from that sin? Lord, change my heart. Lord, change the way I think. The blameless, the last part of verse 20, the blameless in their ways are the delight of God. The men and women can delight God. God can be happy with you. Enjoy your presence. And this is the idea here. It calls on the idea that we need a heart transformation. This proverb hints at this New Testament promise that God would give us a brand new heart. That he would take the heart of wickedness or selfishness, the heart of sin, and replace it with a heart of love, of grace and mercy towards others. And it stems again from this relationship with this living God. It again is this gift that keeps on giving. It's about, everything is about a relationship with God. It influences your family life, your work life, your school life. It influences everything. And it will reap great, great rewards for you if you abide in this relationship. We do need to have a sincere heart, to be focused on what does God want. You and I need to be careful that we are not riding the fence, as somebody said the other day. That we're not in between things, that we're fully committed to follow Christ. Remember, God is, although his standard is perfection, he understands our weaknesses. And so in humility, we come to him and say, God, I'm sorry, I messed up again. He's gracious and willing to forgive us, seeking to restore us and to forgive us. But if instead we go, God, I don't need your help, I can do it all my own, then God takes his hands off and lets us become or receive the consequences for our own sinfulness or rebellion. Verse 21, though they join forces, the wicked will not go unpunished, but the prosperity of the righteous will be delivered. Again, although the wicked might join together, there might be a gang, a group of them, they will not go. This is God's promise. They will not go unpunished. Back in Genesis chapter 11, you may recall after the flood of Noah's flood, that mankind got together and they decided, let's build a tower, what we call the Tower of Babel. Let's join together and let's resist God and do things our own way. We as humankind can come together and do our own stuff. So what did God do? He confused their languages so that they couldn't build things together. So although they had joined together, God did not allow their wickedness to go unpunished. Verse 22, as a ring of gold in a swine's snout, so is a lovely woman who lacks discretion. I don't know how many of you have been around pigs or farmers or anything else like that. And yes, you can clean a pig up, and it can look pretty nice for a short time. Where did my pig thing go? If you can find it back there, that would be great. Did I go past? There it is, thank you. So this little gold ring here, obviously this is photoshopped in, but as beautiful as a gold ring would be, how ridiculous it would be to put it in the snout of a pig. And if you remember how pigs eat, they tear up the ground or they go into the grub with their snout. And the ring would probably fall out and be lost forever. So it's a hilarious, it's sort of a funny, absurd word picture that Solomon is using here. That we would think of putting something valuable and precious in the swine's snout and expect it to stay there as an adornment. And he contrasts that, so is a woman who lacks discretion. And we could say a man or a woman. So a woman can be extremely beautiful in outward appearance, but if she lacks discretion, it destroys all of her so-called beauty. She could be the model in a magazine sort of thing, but if she lacks discretion, her value, her worth is destroyed. However, our value is in a relationship with Jesus Christ. It's not about the outward adornment. I'm not saying that we shouldn't dress nice or you can't put clothes on, but it's not about that. Before God, he's not looking at you and saying, wow, you have a really nice Christmas sweater on. Or he's not saying, man, that's an ugly Christmas sweater. What God is looking at is our hearts. Where are our hearts before him? So the woman in this particular case is abandoning discretion, or living an immoral life is here implied. So it's the idea of although I may have all the beauty, or with men I could be very handsome, I could have all the sports cars and all the fame, but if I don't have discretion, it takes away all the stuff that I might want to show off to other people. Verse 23, the desire of the righteous is only good, but the expectation of the wicked is wrath. A righteous man or woman wants to see good happening in life around them. They want to see others prospering. But the wicked is revengeful if somebody else prospers. Verse 24, there is one who scatters, yet increases more. And there's one who withholds more than is right, and it leads to poverty. Here's the idea. It's the idea of somebody who is not a wasteful distribution, but it's the idea of being biblically gracious and generous to others, of sharing what you do have, as opposed to somebody who holds on thinking that they don't want to lose anything. You see, we never lose when we give graciously unto God and to His work. Should we exercise wisdom? Absolutely. Because there are some people on TV and other places that are just there to take your money. Play on your heartstrings and take your money. But as you give to God generously, now notice it's not about a dollar amount. God isn't counting how many zeros are on that piece of money or that check that you write. What He's counting is your heart. Are you giving generously to the Lord and to His work? For some of us, to be generous means we shared $1. For somebody else, it might be 10 or 100 or 1,000. But notice that God is not judging the dollar amount. He's judging our generosity from our hearts. But if you withhold, if you see somebody else in need and you have the ability to give it to them and you withhold it, guess what it leads to? More poverty in your own life. The generous soul will be made rich, verse 25. And he who waters will also be watered himself. Here's the idea, same sort of idea of being generous towards others. And in Acts chapter 20, verse 35, it's more blessed to give than to receive. Now, it might be a little hard to explain that to a 5-year-old at Christmas time. You know what? You're going to be more blessed if you give. But as parents and grandparents, we can instill that sort of idea into our own children, even at Christmas time. That's why I think the shoebox thing is such a blessing, to be able to take your child, take him to the store and say, okay, you pick out whatever you like. Now we're going to give it to somebody else. But it's a valuable life lesson for them. So it is for us, and unfortunately, many times we're still learning those sort of lessons. As we share with others, we actually get blessed. The minister who brings forth a message of salvation is refreshing his own soul at the same time. The Sunday school teacher, when they teach valuable lessons to the children, guess what? They're also getting instructed. Did you realize that? As you work with children's ministry, or you lead this thing or that thing, you also get a blessing back. Every spiritual gift, every active work of the grace of God increases by exercise of that gift. But if we don't exercise the gifts that God has given us, guess what? Those gifts begin to wither. Oh, God has gifted each and every one of you. Not exactly the same, but differently. It's the same God that gives different gifts, but some of you have gifts of wisdom, or hospitality, or administration, or generosity, gifts of help. And you have those gifts, use them. And as you use them, guess what? That gift will become more effective. If, however, you know I've got the gift of helps, but I don't want to help anybody, as an example, then that gift withers away. It's like an arm or a limb that we never exercise. And so use your gifts. It's better to give than just simply to receive. Verse 26, the people will curse him who withholds grain, but blessing will be on the head of those who sell it. Here's the idea, and we see this in our culture today. It was an ancient culture problem. Somebody wants to corner the market on something. Let's say, I don't know, beets. And so they gather all the beets that they can, but they don't sell them to anybody, in the hopes that the prices would go skyrocketing, and then they can make a windfall by cornering the market on beets. However, that's the wicked man. The generous person says, yes, I have beets, and I'm happy to sell them to you. And that's where we need to be with that, is that we'd be willing to share with others, not looking just for our own personal selfishness, but how can we really help others? Verse 27, he who earnestly seeks good finds favor, but trouble will come to him who seeks evil. If you seek out favor or to be a blessing to others, guess what? God will bless you for that. And you'll find favor. If instead you're seeking evil, unfortunately, guess what you'll find? Evil. Verse 28, he who trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like foliage. You see, the righteous man or woman needs to not trust in the riches, but in God. And if you trust in God, not your riches, you will find a life that's flourishing. God is not opposed to you being wealthy, by the way. I want to be clear on that. But if your trust is in wealth, it's going to only fade away. So if God blesses you, you've got a career, you did some business deals or real estate or whatever else, and you got an abundance of funds, praise the Lord for that and use that for God's glory. But if instead you go about life looking how you can take advantage of somebody else, or looking for an opportunity to steal from somebody else, then you're going to get what you sowed is going to come right back at you. He who troubles his own house will inherit the wind. It seems like a little bit of a silly proverb there, but here's the idea. If you bring trouble, guess what your inheritance is going to be? Nothing. Years ago, as I was a little kid, there was a family story that was retold every Christmas. I'm sure it was true. I don't know this. Well, I do know. My uncle did finally admit that it was true. But one year, one of my uncles, when he was a little boy, snuck around the house and figured out what all of his Christmas presents were. And then he boldly declared to my grandmother, I know what all my Christmas presents are. So guess what my grandmother did? She hid all the Christmas presents and put ashes inside the boxes. And so that when he opened up his Christmas gifts on Christmas morning, he got nothing but boxes full of ashes. Now you know where I get a little bit of my attitude from sometimes. But here's the blessing. If you bring trouble into your house, guess what you're going to get? You're going to get ashes or the wind. You're not going to inherit anything of value. But the fool, in this sense, the fool is maybe that gullible person, the uneducated person, the one that doesn't kind of figure out everything. But the fool will be the servant to the wise in heart. It's the idea that God wants to turn the tables, that your relationship with Jesus Christ makes you wise. And because of that, even if you don't have the education, or you don't have the various skill sets that everyone else wants to look up to, but because you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, he counts that as great wisdom. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, verse 30. But he who wins souls is wise. What a fabulous thing. You see, righteousness bears fruit, and that fruit gives life. Of course, in the New Testament, we speak about this as the fruit of the Spirit. And there's a couple of places in Ephesians chapter 5, but also in Galatians chapter 5. And I want to point out to you Galatians chapter 5 here, if I can get my thing to work for me. Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 through 23 say this, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. So the fruit of the righteous is this tree of life. The fruit of somebody who has this gift that keeps on giving, that has a relationship with the living God. The person who has embraced godly wisdom is the person who has the fruit of the Spirit in their life. As you look at your own life, can you say, or do you think others would say of you, oh, she's loving, or he's full of joy. He has the peace of God that surpasses understanding. She's long-suffering, or that word patience. That she suffers long under difficulty. Or that he is filled with kindness or goodness. Or there's a woman, there's a man who's faithful, who's gentle. That sometimes you have to say hard things to people, but you can do it in a gentle way, like we already read in this proverb, to be able to say the right word at the right time. Are you a man or a woman that exercises self-control? Or I like to put it this way, Christ control. Do you just go and do whatever comes to your mind and whatever you think of at that moment? Or are you exercising self-control? That's the fruit of the Spirit of God in your life. Are you a person that does that sort of thing? Do you have this abiding, living relationship with God that gives the gift that keeps on giving? And if so, then you're a person who's intentional about winning souls. Are you intentional about winning souls? I'm not saying that everyone's going to be a Billy Graham or a Greg Laurie or Finney or some other of these guys that was used mightily of the Lord. But are you intentional about the idea of, I want to see souls won for God? Do we use God's word in our own words to win or to romance somebody to a living relationship with a living God? Do you explain to them and convey to them the tremendous love that God has for them? Do you use your words and then also your actions to let people know that there is a love for them that goes beyond circumstances? Do you use your words in a sense in a war, a battle of words or a battle of wits, in the sense of winning somebody's soul to answer their questions when they have opposition, when they have questions and they're uncertain about things? Do you take time to research or to convey to them answers that are in the Bible? Most of the time we run across people that say the Bible is full of all kinds of hypocrisy, all kinds of contradictions. My favorite response when they say that is, okay, show me one. And most of the time they can't. And there's a few things that they might be able to find. And when they do, usually if you read the verse before and the verse after, it answers the question. So I'm not trying to be a smarty out. I'm just saying, well, okay, if you say it's filled with all kinds of contradictions, then show it to me. And most of the time, 99.9% of the time, they can't. Or they say this thing or that thing. And then to be able to give them answers. And now you may not know the answers, but then go back to the earlier proverb that talked about a multitude of counselors. If you don't know the answer, then go find somebody who does know the answer. And then come back to them. Hey, I'll meet you on Tuesday for lunch. I'm going to find the answer to that question. And then find that answer and talk with them. So, do you use your words to romance or to express to them, not a romantic relationship between a husband and wife or between a man and a woman, but the idea that conveying to them the love, the tremendous love that God has for them. To answer their questions that the spiritual battle might be won. Do you understand that it is a spiritual battle? Do you have that same vigor? Like we get excited, well, I get excited for different sports teams. And I get frustrated with them, and then I get excited about them. If they're winning, I'm excited. If they're not winning, it's not such a big deal. Or maybe somebody's a fan of movies. Some people I already know have tickets for December, what is it? 14th at midnight for the Star Wars thing, right? So somebody who's a fan of that, right? Okay. But do we have that same sort of excitement about our relationship with God? For others, it's music. Oh, I just got this new CD or this new thing or this group just dropped this new track and I want to share it with you. Do we have that same sort of excitement about our relationship with God? We ought to. And you see, the idea is that he who wins souls is wise because they have the gift that keeps on giving. It's all about our relationship with Christ. Verse 31, if the righteous will be recompensed on the earth, how much more the ungodly and the sinner? If God promises to bless you because you're following him, understand this. He is going to judge those who reject him. And that's why it's super important for us to be in the business, in the prospect of introducing others to the gift that keeps on giving, which is Jesus Christ. Now, there's all kinds of gifts that we can give at Christmas time. You know, you can get the newest whatever is out there, newest toy, newest electronics, newest this or that. But it's all going to fade. When our kids were little, they were more interested in the box that they came in than the item itself. Sometimes that happens. When I was a kid, I broke things usually within 2 weeks. Again, the box lasted longer than the toy lasted. And there's nothing wrong with giving gifts to your children, giving gifts to family members, but understand this. There's no greater gift than the relationship with Jesus Christ. It far outweighs anything. It will last you not just for a lifetime, but for eternity. A relationship with Jesus Christ will outlast and endure all the difficulties of life. Whether life goes really hard for you or is really a blessing, the gift of knowing Jesus Christ will far outweigh any difficulties or any blessings that you might have in your life. So where are you at this morning? Do you have the gift that keeps on giving? Do you have a relationship with God? Not just an intellectual, I know about God. Because we've talked about this as we've gone through Proverbs. Proverbs is talking about wisdom, which is taking knowledge from your mind or your head and sinking it in the depth of your heart. In this proverb this morning, we've looked at it, and it keeps talking about a person that displays a relationship with God. The wicked, by their actions, display they have no regard for God. The righteous, as we look through this proverb, are people that are mindful about the relationship with God and that things that they do here on this planet will have eternal consequences. Blessings, if you follow the Lord, or curses or judgment if you reject Him. And Jesus said it quite simply, that we must come to Him to have everlasting life. There's no other way. At Christmas time, again, we can get busy with holiday and giving gifts and this thing and that thing, and the commercialization of the time that we live in can choke out the meaning of Christmas. But the greatest gift that you can ever have, the gift that keeps on giving, is this loving, abiding, or God-dependent relationship with Jesus Christ. There's no better gift. It will last for eternity. Even if you get something with a lifetime guarantee, it's only guaranteed for what? Your lifetime, not for eternity. And this is the one thing that you can have that'll outlast not only your life, but last you through eternity. So I urge you to be right with God. If you find yourself in some way not right with God this morning, I urge you, right where you sit, to stop and ask God, God, get me right. Lord, I've been putting too much focus on something else. I have anger or bitterness or whatever else in my life that's choking out a relationship with you. And Lord, I simply ask that you would remove that you'd forgive me of my sins, that you'd come into my life and transform me, just like you promised you would. And if you'll do that, God will be faithful to answer that prayer. You may recall over in 1 John 1:9, it says this, if we confess our sins to Him, He is faithful and just to forgive us of our sin